My name is Lieutenant Marcus Kane. I've spent 12 years in special operations, but none of my missions prepared me for what we encountered in the backwoods of Tennessee. They called it a containment operation, but we all knew better. When the government sends you into a place like Smoky Ridge with live ammunition and a mandate to neutralize threats, it's never something normal. The team consisted of 5 operatives, including myself. There was our tracker, Wesson, a wiry guy with a sixth sense for reading terrain. Price, a demolitions expert who always carried too much gear. Vargas, our medic who never let her guard down. And Lutz, the sniper who could thread a needle from a mile away. We all had our specialties, but none of us had experience with whatever this was. We were briefed en route to the location. A series of disappearances in the Smoky Ridge area had raised alarm bells. Locals, hikers, even wildlife seemed to vanish without a trace. The few witnesses who came forward spoke of blood-curdling screams in the dead of night, screams that didn't belong to any known animal. Collins, our handler, summed it up succinctly. High probability of cryptid activity. Proceed with extreme caution. We set up base in an old ranger station near the edge of the forest. The place had been abandoned for years, its walls covered in graffiti and its windows broken out. It smelled of mildew and decay, but it offered us a defensible position. As night fell, the forest seemed to come alive with unfamiliar sounds. The usual chirping of crickets and rustling of leaves was absent, replaced by an unsettling silence broken only by the occasional snap of a branch or distant howl. "That's no coyote," Wesson muttered, his hand resting on the grip of his rifle. None of us argued. By midnight, we were moving. The moonlight barely penetrated the dense canopy, and our flashlights painted the forest in stark, flickering beams. The air was thick with the scent of wet earth and something acrid, like burning hair. Wesson led the way, his movements cautious but deliberate. The tracker's sharp eyes caught every broken branch and disturbed patch of dirt. But even he seemed uneasy. "This ain't right," he said after we stumbled upon a clearing littered with carcasses. Deer, raccoons, even a black bear. Their bodies were shredded, as if something massive had torn through them. "Predators don't kill like this. It's just wasteful." "Maybe it's marking territory," Vargas suggested, though her tone betrayed her uncertainty. Lutz knelt beside one of the carcasses, his face grim. "These cuts aren't clean. It's like whatever did this had claws, but they're jagged, uneven." "Eyes up," I ordered, scanning the tree line. The oppressive feeling of being watched had crept over me the moment we entered the clearing, and then we heard it. A scream tore through the night, a sound so piercing and primal it made my blood run cold. It wasn't human, but it wasn't entirely animal either. It was a guttural, mournful howl that seemed to vibrate through the very ground beneath us. "Contact west," Lutz shouted, his rifle snapping up to his shoulder. We all turned as a massive shape broke from the trees, moving with terrifying speed. The beam of my flashlight caught it briefly, and what I saw chilled me to the core. The creature stood on 2 legs, but it wasn't human. Its body was covered in matted black fur, and its head resembled a wolf's, but more elongated, with a snout filled with razor-sharp teeth. Its eyes glowed red in the darkness, and its hands, if you could call them that, ended in claws as long as knives. It let out another howl as it charged, the sound rattling my skull. "Fire!" I yelled, opening up with my rifle. The rest of the team followed suit, the forest erupting in a cacophony of gunfire and snarls. The creature moved with unnatural agility, weaving between the trees and closing the distance faster than seemed possible. It swiped at Wesson, its claws raking across his chest and sending him sprawling. Vargas was on him in an instant, dragging him back as Price lobbed a grenade at the beast. The explosion lit up the forest, sending splinters of wood and dirt flying. For a moment, there was silence, and I dared to hope that we'd taken it down. But then the smoke cleared, and there it was, its fur singed, but its body seemingly unharmed. It bared its teeth in a grotesque grin before vanishing back into the shadows. "Fall back to the station," I ordered, my voice tight with urgency. We moved as fast as we could, Wesson's weight slowing us down. The forest seemed to close in around us, every shadow a potential threat. That thing, whatever it was, wasn't done with us. We could hear it, circling, its growls echoing through the trees. By the time we reached the ranger station, we were out of breath and nearly out of ammo. We barricaded the doors and windows, every one of us on edge. The night dragged on. The creature's howls growing closer, more frequent. It was toying with us, testing our defenses. At one point, its massive claws raked across the wooden walls, sending splinters flying and Vargas into a flurry of curses. As dawn approached, the howls finally ceased. When the first rays of sunlight broke through the trees, the oppressive weight lifted. But the damage was done. Wesson was alive, but barely, his chest a mangled mess. The rest of us were exhausted, our nerves frayed. Collins met us at the extraction point, his expression as unreadable as ever. "Report," he said curtly. "It's still out there," I replied, my voice heavy with defeat. "We didn't kill it, didn't even slow it down." Collins's lips thinned, but he didn't seem surprised. "We'll cordon off the area, mark it as a red zone." As we boarded the chopper, I couldn't shake the feeling that Smoky Ridge had claimed a piece of us. That thing, the Howler as we'd started calling it, was still out there, lurking in the shadows. And I knew, deep down, that this wasn't over. Not for me. Not for any of us. My name is Ethan Cole, and in the winter of 2019, I was part of a classified cryptid hunting operation deep in the Colorado Rockies. We were deployed to Crimson Peak, a jagged, snow-covered mountain range where entire search and rescue teams had gone missing. Their last transmissions described a massive predator moving through the snow at impossible speeds. Local legends called it the Devourer, but no one could tell us what it actually was, only that it left no survivors. Our team consisted of Captain Lee Harper, Tracker Avery Rhodes, Heavy Weapons Specialist Greg Holt, Tech Operator Jamie Lynn, and myself. The helicopter dropped us at a base camp near the summit. The snowstorm was relentless, whipping around us and reducing visibility to almost nothing. "Thermals up," Harper ordered as we stepped into the freezing wind. Jamie activated her equipment, the thermal scanner cutting through the blizzard. "Nothing yet," she said, her voice muffled through her mask. "That doesn't mean it's not out there," Avery muttered, her eyes scanning the white expanse. The base camp was in ruins, shredded tents, scattered supplies, and blood frozen into the snow. Tracks led away from the camp, but they didn't look human. The impressions were enormous, clawed, and staggered in a pattern that suggested whatever made them wasn't walking, it was bounding. "Whatever it is, it's big," Greg said, hefting his rifle. "And it's hunting." We followed the tracks into the storm, the wind howling around us like a living thing. The air felt wrong, heavy, charged with something I couldn't explain. "This storm isn't natural," Jamie said, adjusting her gear. "It's like the weather's centered on the peak." "Focus," Harper snapped. "Eyes up. Stay together." We advanced cautiously, our weapons ready, but the tracks abruptly stopped near a ridge. The snow was undisturbed beyond that point, as if the creature had vanished into thin air. "Did it climb?" Avery asked, looking up at the jagged cliffs above us. "No," Harper said, her voice tense. "It's waiting." Before anyone could respond, a low, rumbling growl echoed through the storm. It wasn't the wind. It was something massive, something close. "Thermals!" Harper barked. Jamie's scanner lit up with movement, a massive heat signature circling us too fast to track. "It's moving!" she shouted, panic creeping into her voice. Then it appeared. The Devourer burst out of the storm, a hulking silhouette against the snow. It was over 12 feet tall, covered in thick, matted fur streaked with crimson. Its eyes glowed a fiery red, and its claws were long and curved, cutting through the snow like blades. "Open fire!" Harper shouted. We unleashed everything we had. Rifles, grenades, high-caliber rounds. But the creature moved like a blur, dodging our attacks with terrifying speed. When we finally landed a hit, it roared, the sound shaking the ground beneath our feet. "It's pissed now," Greg said, reloading his weapon. The Devourer lunged, its massive claws swiping at Avery. She dove to the side, narrowly avoiding the strike. But the creature was relentless. It slammed into her with its shoulder, sending her flying into a snowbank. "Keep moving," Harper ordered, dragging Avery to her feet. The creature disappeared into the storm, its growls echoing around us as it circled. "It's toying with us," Jamie said, her hands trembling as she scanned the area. "It's separating us," Harper corrected, her voice grim. The next attack came from above. The devourer leapt from the cliffs, landing in the middle of our formation and scattering us like leaves. Its claws tore through Greg's armor as if it were paper, lifting him off the ground before tossing him into the snow. "Greg!" I shouted, firing into the beast's back. The bullets hit, but the creature barely flinched. It turned toward me, its glowing eyes locking onto mine. For a moment, I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. It wasn't just a predator, it was something ancient, something wrong. "Fall back!" Harper shouted, breaking the spell. We retreated toward the ridge, the creature pursuing us through the storm. It moved faster than anything that size should have been able to, closing the distance with every bound. "We're not going to make it!" Jamie shouted, her voice breaking. "Yes, we will!" Harper barked, planting an explosive charge in the snow. When the creature lunged again, Harper detonated the charge. The explosion lit up the storm, sending snow and debris flying. The creature roared, its massive body crashing to the ground. "Is it down?" I asked, my voice shaking. "Not for long," Harper said. "Move!" We scrambled toward the extraction point, the helicopter's blades cutting through the storm in the distance. Behind us, the devourer rose, its roar louder than ever. We reached the chopper just as the creature emerged from the storm, its glowing eyes burning through the darkness. The door slammed shut, and we lifted off, the devourer's claws swiping at the air just beneath us. The official report blamed the disappearances on severe weather conditions and an unidentified apex predator. Crimson Peak was declared a restricted zone, marked off-limits on every map. But we know the truth. The devourer isn't just a predator. It's the apex, the ruler of that storm-shrouded mountain. And if you listen closely when the wind howls, you might still hear its roar. My name is Sam, and for most of my adult life, I was a ghost. A shadow in places most people would never know existed. Officially, I was part of a task force under the Department of Defense. Unofficially, we hunted what wasn't supposed to exist. The call came in the middle of the night, as it always did. My handler, a cold-voiced man named Collins, gave me the barest details. Black Hollow Forest, upstate New York, asset containment, eyes only, high threat level. That was all I needed to know. Within hours, I was on a Black Hawk, heading into the wilderness with 3 other operatives. The air was sharp with the scent of pine and damp earth, and the weight of my gear pressed against my shoulders like a familiar old friend. But the tension in the helicopter was thick. We all knew this wasn't a routine op. By the time we landed, dusk had fallen, casting the forest in an eerie twilight. Collins's voice crackled in my earpiece. "Satellite imagery shows movement in Quadrant 7. You're looking for an unidentified cryptid. Multiple civilian sightings. Livestock mutilations. 0 survivors among reported campers. It's aggressive, intelligent. Proceed with caution." Aggressive and intelligent. Great. We moved in a staggered formation, each of us alert to every rustle of the underbrush and shadow that flickered in the fading light. The forest was silent in a way that felt wrong. No birds, no insects, just the crunch of our boots and the occasional whisper of wind through the trees. Even the smell was off, a faint metallic tang that made my stomach churn. An hour in, we found the first campsite, or what was left of it. The tents were shredded, their bright nylon hanging in tatters from the trees. Blood spattered the ground, dark and sticky, soaking into the dirt. But there were no bodies, no tracks, just chaos. I felt my pulse quicken as a low growl seemed to rumble from the shadows. Or maybe it was just the wind. "Stay sharp," I muttered into the comms, my voice low. The others murmured their acknowledgement, but there was an edge of unease in their responses. We all felt it, the sensation of being watched. As night fell, the forest transformed into a labyrinth of shadows. Our night vision goggles painted the world in shades of green, but it didn't make the oppressive darkness any less suffocating. We pressed deeper into the trees, the air growing colder with every step. The smell of rot began to creep in, faint at first, then overwhelming. It clung to the back of my throat, making me gag. Movement. 10 o'clock, came the hushed voice of Ramirez, the youngest member of our team. I swung my rifle toward the direction he indicated, my finger steady on the trigger. The shadows seemed to ripple, but nothing materialized. Ramirez swore under his breath. I know I saw something. Hold your fire until confirmed, I ordered, my voice steadier than I felt. The forest seemed to close in around us, the trees leaning in like silent witnesses. The metallic smell grew stronger, mingling with the stench of decay. Then we heard it. A guttural snarl, low and menacing, that seemed to reverberate through the ground. I froze, my heart pounding. The sound came again, closer this time. I signaled for the team to fan out, each of us covering a different direction. The air felt electric, charged with an invisible threat. And then it emerged. At first, it was just a shape, hulking and massive, moving with unnatural speed between the trees. My brain struggled to process what I was seeing. It was taller than a bear, its limbs long and sinewy, ending in claws that glinted even in the dim light. Its eyes glowed a sickly yellow, and its mouth, a grotesque maw filled with jagged teeth, dripped with something dark and viscous. "Contact!" I shouted, opening fire. The rest of the team followed suit, the forest erupting in a cacophony of gunfire and snarls. The creature moved with impossible agility, dodging between trees and lunging toward Ramirez. He screamed as it swiped at him, its claws tearing through his vest like paper. Blood sprayed, and Ramirez went down. "Fall back!" I yelled, my voice barely audible over the chaos. We retreated, dragging Ramirez's limp form with us. The creature didn't pursue. It stood there watching, its eyes burning into us like twin embers. And then, with a guttural growl, it melted back into the shadows. We didn't stop until we reached the extraction point. Ramirez was alive barely, his chest a mess of torn flesh. The medics worked frantically as the Black Hawk lifted off, the forest shrinking beneath us. None of us spoke. There was nothing to say. Back at the base, Collins debriefed us with his usual detached professionalism. The creature was classified as a Type 4 cryptid, highly dangerous and elusive. Our mission was deemed a success because we had contained the threat by driving it deeper into the wilderness. But we all knew the truth. We hadn't stopped it. We had barely survived. I still see its eyes in my nightmares, hear the guttural snarl that shook me to my core. Black Hollow Forest is off limits now, a red zone on every map. But sometimes late at night I wonder if it's still out there, watching, waiting. And I wonder how long it will be before someone else strays too close to the darkness. They called it Operation Blackwater, a name so generic it might have been plucked from a bad spy novel. We knew better. Names like that meant things no one wanted to talk about, least of all the brass sending us in. My name's Corporal Jack Merritt, former Special Forces, and for reasons I'll never understand, they decided I was the guy for the job. It started with a briefing light on details and heavy on threats. No leaks, no questions, no glory. Just a mission in the deep Louisiana swamps to investigate reports of hostile activity. That was the language they used. But when the colonel started fumbling for words, I saw the truth in his eyes. He was scared. Not for us, but of whatever had spooked the locals enough to shut down an entire parish. The swamp smelled like death, thick with the stink of stagnant water and rotting vegetation. Even with night vision, the place was a maze of black water, gnarled cypress roots, and shadows that seemed to move when you weren't looking. We were 5 in total: me, Sarge, Kowalski, Pierce, and Thorne, our government observer. Thorne didn't talk much, which was fine by us. His shiny boots and clipboard marked him as a desk jockey who'd never been this far from civilization. We set out just before sundown, moving quiet, weapons ready. The deeper we went, the quieter it got. No frogs, no crickets, just the occasional splash of something too big to be a fish. By midnight, the silence was deafening. Pierce was the first to see it. Movement. 9 o'clock, he whispered, freezing mid-step. We all stopped, scanning the darkness. A shape darted between the trees, too fast and too big to be human. Kowalski cursed under his breath, and Sarge motioned for us to tighten up. Whatever it wasn't alone. Shadows flickered on the edges of our vision, always just out of sight. Thorne scribbled something in his notebook and muttered, "Stay alert." No kidding, genius. We followed the trail deeper, the water rising to our knees. The first body showed up about half an hour later. What was left of it anyway? It was a man, or had been, a local by the looks of his tattered clothes. His chest was torn open like a ripe melon, ribs snapped clean through. No claw marks, no bullet holes, just shredded meat and bone. Sarge muttered a prayer, and Thorne snapped a picture, his face pale. "This is bad," Pierce said, his voice barely a whisper. "It's about to get worse," I replied. We didn't see the second body until it was too late. Kowalski stumbled over it, nearly falling face first into the muck. This one was fresher, the blood still pooling around it. The throat was torn out, but the face was intact enough to show the terror frozen in its wide, glassy eyes. "Something's hunting us," Kowalski said, gripping his rifle like a lifeline. "Not us," Thorne corrected. "Not yet." I wanted to ask what he meant by that, but before I could, the air changed. You could feel it. Thick, heavy, electric, like the moment before a lightning strike. And then we heard it. A low, guttural growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. It wasn't any animal I'd ever heard, and I've heard them all. The growl turned into a howl, long and mournful, sending a shiver down my spine. Thorne whispered something under his breath. A name, I think, but I didn't catch it. Sarge barked an order, and we formed a defensive circle, rifles trained outward. It came from the water, rising like a nightmare out of the depths. At first I thought it was just a trick of the light, a shadow too big to be real. But then it moved, and I realized we were looking at something impossibly huge. Its skin was slick and dark, like wet leather, and its eyes glowed faintly green in the moonlight. It had the rough shape of a man, but hunched and twisted, with arms that hung too low and fingers tipped with claws. "Fire!" Sarge yelled. And we did. The noise was deafening in the stillness, the flashes of our rifles lighting up the swamp like fireworks. The thing didn't flinch. It moved faster than anything that size had any right to, swiping at Pierce and sending him flying into the water. He didn't come back up. We kept shooting, but it was like throwing pebbles at a tank. It lunged at Kowalski, claws raking across his chest. He screamed, a sound I'll never forget, before collapsing in a heap. Sarge threw a grenade, and for a second, I thought we'd done it. The explosion lit up the swamp, and the thing disappeared into the water with a deafening roar. "Fall back," Sarge ordered, dragging Kowalski's lifeless body as we retreated. Thorne was already ahead of us, muttering into his radio. "The target is hostile. Repeat, the target is hostile." No kidding, genius. We didn't stop running until we hit dry land. By then it was just me, Sarge, and Thorne. The swamp was quiet again, but it wasn't the kind of silence that made you feel safe. It was the kind that made you feel hunted. "What the hell was that?" I asked, still gasping for breath. Thorne didn't answer. He just scribbled in his notebook and muttered, "Classified." Sarge looked at me, his face grim. "We're not coming back from this, are we?" I didn't answer. We both knew the truth. In the end, it wasn't the monster that got us. It was the silence, the waiting, the not knowing if it was still out there watching, waiting for us to make a mistake. By the time the rescue chopper arrived, Thorne was gone, and Sarge was catatonic. I was the only one left to tell the story. But here's the thing. I don't think they wanted me to. A week after I got home, there was a knock on my door. 2 men in suits, all polite smiles and vague threats, telling me to forget everything I saw. I told them I would, but I lied. Because some things shouldn't be forgotten. Some things need to be told. And if you're ever near Blackwater Swamp, do yourself a favor, don't go in the water. The air was thick that night. the kind of thickness that clings to your skin and makes every breath feel like a struggle. I had been on countless operations in the past, but none quite like this. My name's Tony. Sergeant Tony Holloway, U.S. Special Forces, recently retired. I'd been hunting cryptids for a while now, mostly out of curiosity and the kind of idle fascination you get after decades of staring into the unknown. This, though? This was different. We were in Pine Ridge, a secluded area deep in the Smoky Mountains. I'd heard stories, whispers about creatures that weren't supposed to exist, the kinds of things that don't fit the usual reports. So, we went in, not as soldiers but as hunters, part of a covert government operation, though the brass never really gave us all the details. We were a small team, just 4 of us. We had our standard gear, rifles, infrared cameras, and night vision goggles. But that didn't feel like enough. It never does when you're dealing with things that shouldn't be out there. The first night passed uneventfully, but something gnawed at me. You could feel the land around us wasn't normal. The trees, thick and ancient, seemed to close in on you as if they were watching. The wind was too still, the kind that has weight, like it's holding its breath. I was used to the silence that comes with deep woods, but this was a different kind of quiet. No animals, no sounds of rustling leaves or distant hoots of owls, just the suffocating silence. The second night we were out, keeping low, trying to remain undetected. The moon barely peeked through the thick canopy above, casting faint shadows on the forest floor. We set up near a ridge, not far from a clearing we'd identified earlier as a hotspot. That's when we heard it. It wasn't a sound I could immediately place. At first I thought it was the wind, maybe an animal scraping through the brush. But it wasn't. It was a low, guttural growl, deep enough to vibrate your chest. My heart dropped in an instant. It was too human, yet not. It came from somewhere behind us, moving fast. I gave the team a signal to freeze, and we all did, holding our breath. Every muscle in my body tensed, and I gripped my rifle tighter. I looked at the others, their faces pale in the dim light, eyes wide. None of us said a word. Whatever it was, it knew we were here. The air seemed to get colder, and a shiver crawled down my spine. It came closer. Too close. Then, like a damn nightmare, it stepped into the clearing. At first I thought it was a man, or at least something that resembled one. But it wasn't. Its body was too wide, too hunched, and it moved with a kind of fluidity that defied human limits. The thing's face, if you could even call it a face, was like a twisted mask of shadows, with faint glowing eyes set deep in sockets. Its mouth, no, its maw, split open in a grin that was more horrifying than any beast I'd ever seen. It didn't blink, didn't move like an animal. It just stared, fixing us in place with an unholy gaze. I should have shot it. I had the chance. But something stopped me. A feeling. It was almost like the thing was looking into my soul, figuring me out. And I couldn't bring myself to pull the trigger. It stayed there, staring at us for what felt like hours, its breath shallow and ragged. Then, without a sound, it turned. It didn't flee but walked away into the dark, as if we were nothing. Just another part of the woods. We didn't sleep that night. We stayed in a tight circle, weapons drawn, eyes darting around us. The thing never returned, but I knew something had changed. That was only the beginning. The following night was the worst. I don't know if it was the tension from the first encounter or the dread of what might come, but we all felt it. We weren't alone. We were being watched. We kept our movements to a minimum, sticking to the shadows, hoping to catch whatever was out there in the open. I could hear my own breath now, shallow, unsteady. I hated the way it echoed in the silence. It wasn't until the last few hours before dawn that we saw it again. Only this time it wasn't one. It was 3. 3 of them, each more grotesque than the last. They moved in sync, their heavy bodies blending into the darkness, eyes glinting with that eerie, otherworldly light. There was no hesitation in their movements, no fear. They were hunting, and we were the prey. We had no choice but to retreat. No matter how much training you have, when you're up against something that wasn't meant to exist, strategy doesn't matter. It's survival. We managed to get back to base without losing anyone, but I'll never forget that night. The creatures we encountered in Pine Ridge weren't like anything I've ever seen, heard, or read about. They were something else, something older, and I know they're still out there. Whatever they are, they've learned to remain hidden. But I also know we weren't the first to encounter them, and we won't be the last. I've tried to leave that night behind me, tried to convince myself it was all a nightmare, a hallucination brought on by the stress of being out there too long. But I know better now. The silence in those woods wasn't normal. The shadows weren't normal. And I don't think anything will ever be normal again after what I saw. It's still out there, watching, waiting. The Sierra Nevadas are no place for the faint-hearted. Towering pines, jagged cliffs, and valleys so deep they seem to swallow sunlight whole. It's beautiful, sure, but it's the kind of beauty that kills. My name's Sergeant Mike Grayson, and if you think this is another campfire tale about getting lost in the woods, think again. Our mission wasn't in the official record books. We were told it was a simple recon op, sweep an unmarked area of the Sierra National Forest, identify unusual activity, and report back. Unusual activity was a code phrase we'd come to recognize. It meant something had been spotted, something that didn't belong. They paired us with a guide this time, a forest ranger named Lila Holt. She was sharp, no nonsense, and didn't ask questions she knew wouldn't get answers. "You boys ready for a long hike?" she asked, her green uniform standing out against the muted browns of the forest. We nodded. Our team was small. Just me, Corporal Diaz, Private Walker, and the ever-present observer, a man named Cole with an expensive satellite phone and a permanent scowl. He wasn't military, but he called the shots. "Let's move," he said. The first day was uneventful, almost peaceful. The forest was alive with the sounds of birds and rustling leaves, but as we climbed higher into the range, the atmosphere shifted. The air grew colder, the trees thicker. Even the birds seemed to disappear. Lila stopped suddenly, holding up a hand. "Do you smell that?" We sniffed the air. It was faint but unmistakable. A metallic tang, like copper mixed with decay. "Blood," she said, her voice low. She pointed to the ground ahead, where the dirt was stained dark red. The first carcass we found was a deer, or what was left of it. Its body was torn open, ribs jutting out like broken cage bars. The head was missing, but the spine looked snapped, as if something had twisted it apart. "Bear?" Walker suggested, though he didn't sound convinced. "No bear does this," Lila said, crouching to examine the remains. "Too clean, too precise." Cole took a picture with his phone, muttering something about Phase 1. The rest of us stayed silent. We'd seen things like this before, but the explanations always came later and never made sense. That night, we set up camp near a rocky outcrop overlooking a narrow valley. The wind howled through the trees, carrying with it that same metallic stench. We took turns on watch, though none of us slept well. The forest felt wrong, like it was holding its breath. Around 3 a.m., Diaz woke me. "Grayson, you need to see this." He led me to the edge of the camp, where the trees gave way to a steep drop. At first, I didn't see anything. Then he pointed. There. Something moved in the valley below. It was hard to make out in the moonlight, but it was tall, maybe 8 feet, and unnaturally thin. Its limbs were long and spindly, its movements jerky and insect-like. "Is that a person?" I whispered, though I already knew the answer. "No way," Diaz replied. We watched as it disappeared into the trees, leaving behind only silence. The next morning, we found more bodies. Not just deer this time. There were mountain lions, coyotes, even a black bear, all mutilated in the same way. Lila looked pale but determined. "This thing isn't hunting for food. It's killing for sport." Cole was unusually quiet, his phone glued to his ear. I overheard fragments of his conversation. Pattern is consistent. Escalation likely. No, we're not pulling out yet. By midday, the trail led us to an abandoned cabin. It looked like it hadn't been used in decades, the wood rotting and the roof half collapsed. But the door was ajar, and fresh tracks led inside. Lila and I entered first, weapons drawn. The interior was dark and stank of mildew and something worse, something that made my stomach turn. The walls were covered in deep gouges like claw marks, and the floor was littered with bones. Human bones. "Oh my God," Lila whispered, her flashlight shaking. In the corner of the room, something moved. We spun around, guns trained on the shadows. A man stumbled forward, his face gaunt and eyes wild. "Help me," he croaked, collapsing to the floor. He was barely alive, his clothes shredded, and his skin covered in deep gashes. "It's still here," he gasped. "It's watching us." And then we heard it. A clicking sound, low and rhythmic like stones tapping together. It came from the treetops, circling the cabin. Whatever was out there, it was toying with us. "We need to leave. Now," Lila said, her voice tight with fear. We carried the man out on a makeshift stretcher, moving as fast as we could. The clicking followed us, growing louder, more insistent. It wasn't until we reached a clearing that we saw it again. The creature stood at the edge of the trees, partially hidden by the shadows. This time there was no mistaking its features. Its face, or what passed for one, was a smooth, featureless mask, save for two hollow black eyes that seemed to suck in the light. Its mouth was a jagged slit, and it clicked its teeth together in a grotesque rhythm. "Open fire!" Cole yelled. The thing moved faster than we could react, darting between the trees with impossible speed. Our bullets hit nothing but bark and empty air. Walker screamed as it lunged at him, its claws raking across his chest. He fell to the ground, blood pooling beneath him. "Go, go, go!" I shouted, dragging Lila and Diaz toward the ridge. We ran until our lungs burned, the clicking sound never far behind. At some point, the injured man stopped moving. Cole ordered us to leave him, and we didn't argue. Survival instincts had taken over. By the time we reached the extraction point, it was just me, Lila, and Diaz. Cole was gone, though none of us saw what happened to him. The helicopter arrived minutes later, and we barely made it aboard before the creature appeared at the tree line. It didn't follow. It just stood there watching, its head cocked to one side. I'll never forget those hollow eyes, or the way it clicked its teeth as we flew away. Back at base, they told us to forget everything. "You were never there," the debrief officer said. "This never happened." But it did. And I think they knew exactly what we were walking into. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't natural. It wasn't human. And it's still out there, in the Sierra Nevadas, waiting for its next victim. So if you ever hear clicking in the woods, turn around. Run. Because once it sees you, it won't stop until you're dead. The first thing you learn in Special Forces is how to keep your mind sharp, even when the world around you is falling apart. You're trained to keep your focus, no matter what happens. But nothing in my years of training had prepared me for what I encountered in the Hollow. My name is Ryan Pierce, and I used to be a part of a Black Ops unit, the kind of missions that don't show up in any briefing documents, and the kind of enemies that don't follow the usual rules of engagement. The Hollow was deep in the Appalachian Mountains, so remote that even the locals whispered about it. Strange things had been happening there. Disappearances, odd animal tracks that didn't match anything in the area, and rumors of something large, something unnatural, that hunted in the dark. I was part of a small unit sent in to investigate, but our real mission was to eliminate any threats, or at least report back to command with concrete evidence. We were dropped in by helicopter a few miles from the Hollow. There were no roads, no towns, just thick trees and mist that never seemed to lift, even during the day. My team was cautious, too cautious, even for us. We'd all been through our share of hell and seen things that would break most men. But there was something in the air out here that made even the hardest soldiers uneasy. We set up camp near the edge of the Hollow. The terrain was tough, and the dense woods pressed in on us, making it feel like we were being swallowed whole. That night, we went out for a recon, our mission to gather intel on whatever the locals had been fearing. Our gear was standard: night vision, infrared sensors, the works, but what we hadn't accounted for was the silence. There was nothing. No birds, no insects, not even the usual rustle of animals moving through the underbrush. It was like the world itself had stopped breathing. We pressed on, moving deeper into the hollow, our boots sinking into the damp soil. The deeper we went, the thicker the mist became. It started to wrap around us like something alive, clinging to our faces and hands, making it hard to see more than a few feet in front of us. And then we heard it. It wasn't just a sound. It was a feeling, a low, throbbing hum that seemed to vibrate in my chest. It was like the earth itself was growling, a sound so deep and resonant that it rattled the bones. I froze. My gut told me that something was very wrong, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were supposed to be here, that we were meant to be here. My team was already in position, scanning the surroundings, weapons raised, but there was no enemy to fight, no threat to face, just that hum. We pushed forward, trying to locate the source of the noise. That's when we found it. At first, it was nothing more than a blur in the trees, a shadow that seemed to flicker just beyond our vision. But then, it stepped into the open, and everything I thought I knew about reality shattered. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't a man. It was something in between, a hulking creature that seemed to distort the space around it. Its body was covered in matted fur, but its eyes were what haunted me the most. They were too wide, too human, and they glowed faintly, like something unnatural was living behind them. For a moment, time itself seemed to pause. My mind couldn't process what I was seeing, couldn't comprehend how something so wrong could exist. But there it was, standing in the fog, its breath steaming in the cold air. We didn't hesitate. We opened fire, but the bullets didn't seem to matter. The creature didn't flinch, didn't move as the rounds tore through the mist. It just stood there, watching us with those terrible eyes, as if daring us to do more. Our weapons were useless, and that's when I realized this thing, whatever it was, wasn't just a predator. It was something ancient, something that didn't care about us or the weapons we had or the tactics we used. We were insignificant to it. I don't remember the exact moment we retreated. I only remember the feeling, like being dragged away from something you know you're not supposed to leave behind. I should have fought harder. I should have stayed with my team, but fear took over, and I bolted. The others followed, but it wasn't fast enough. We didn't lose anyone physically, but we all left pieces of ourselves behind that night. We didn't report the creature. We didn't even talk about it. But that's the thing with these missions. They leave a mark. You don't always get to tell your story. Sometimes you're just the one who walks away, and the world goes on pretending like nothing ever happened. But I know what I saw. The Hollow wasn't just a place for cryptids or myths. It was a place for something much worse, something that had been there long before us, and would be there long after we were gone. I still hear that hum in my dreams. My name is Lieutenant Jason Carter, and I don't scare easily. 5 years in the Marines, 3 more running operations for a classified unit. You learn to keep your nerves in check. But Hollow Ridge changed that. We were sent to the Appalachian backcountry under orders that barely made sense. Investigate unusual disturbances affecting the small towns dotting the region. Locals had reported missing livestock, gutted deer, and strange howling that kept them awake at night. Normally, this would have been a job for wildlife services. But when the reports started including missing people, hunters and campers, we were called in. There were 4 of us: me, Staff Sergeant Miller, Corporal Dunn, and our civilian specialist, Dr. Elise Monroe. She was a cryptozoologist, though she insisted on calling herself a field biologist. Whatever title she used, she knew far more about what we were facing than we did. This region's always had stories, she said as we hiked up the ridge. People talk about phantom wolves, skinwalkers, wendigos. Take your pick. But this? This is something new. What makes you so sure? Miller asked, his voice skeptical. Because nothing else howls like that, she replied. As if on cue, the howl rose in the distance. It was deep, guttural, and eerily human. It echoed off the cliffs, sending a shiver down my spine. Dunn muttered something about wolves, but Dr. Monroe shook her head. Wolves don't howl in this frequency range, she said, fiddling with a small recording device. This is unique. We reached the ridge just before nightfall. The air was crisp, and the forest stretched out below us, a sea of black shadows and moonlit clearings. We set up camp in a natural alcove sheltered by boulders. It felt secure enough, though the unease in the air was palpable. At around 2200 hours, the first sign of trouble came. Dunn was on watch when he spotted movement in the tree line. Something's out there, he whispered, his voice tight. We trained our night vision goggles on the area, but all we saw were shifting shadows. Could be deer, Miller suggested. Not unless deer walk upright, Dunn shot back. That was enough to put us all on edge. Dr. Monroe stayed close, her usual academic curiosity replaced with genuine fear. Keep your lights off, she whispered. It's better if we don't attract attention. The second sign came an hour later. A loud crash echoed from the valley below, like a tree being snapped in half. Then came the howl, closer this time. It wasn't just one voice. It was a chorus, rising and falling in a haunting, discordant symphony. They're communicating, Dr. Monroe said, her voice trembling. Who's they? I asked. She didn't answer. We held our positions, rifles at the ready, scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. Then, just as suddenly as the noise began, it stopped. The silence was worse. Every rustle of leaves, every creak of branches sounded like a footstep. And then we saw it. It emerged from the tree line about 50 yards away, silhouetted against the moonlight. At first glance it looked like a wolf, but it was too big, easily 7 feet tall when it stood upright. Its fur was matted, its limbs unnaturally long. Its eyes glowed faintly amber, and its mouth was lined with jagged teeth. Contact! Left flank! Miller shouted. We opened fire, the gunshots ripping through the night. The creature didn't flinch. It moved with terrifying speed, zigzagging between trees as if taunting us. When it finally lunged, it was at Dunn. He screamed as it dragged him into the darkness. We pursued, but by the time we reached him, it was too late. His body was a bloody mess, his throat torn out. The creature was gone, but the sound of howling erupted around us, coming from every direction. There's more than one, I realized, my stomach sinking. Dr. Monroe pulled out a small vial of something and handed it to me. When they get close, use this. What is it? I asked. Trust me, she said, her voice grim. We retreated to higher ground, taking refuge in a cluster of rocks. The howling grew louder, closer, echoing off the cliffs. And then they came. There were 3 of them, their shapes barely visible against the night. They moved with predatory grace, their glowing eyes cutting through the darkness. We fired, but it was like trying to stop a hurricane with a BB gun. One of them leapt at Miller, claws raking across his back. He went down hard, blood pooling beneath him. Dr. Monroe smashed the vial against a rock, releasing a pungent, acrid smell. The creatures hesitated, snarling and circling but not advancing. It's a deterrent, she said, but it won't last long. Then we need to move, I said, helping Miller to his feet. He was alive but barely. His breaths were shallow and his eyes fluttered with shock. We stumbled down the ridge, the creatures stalking us just out of sight. The howling grew fainter, but I could feel their presence, watching, waiting for us to falter. By dawn, we reached the edge of the forest. A helicopter was waiting, its rotors kicking up dust and leaves. We dragged Miller aboard and collapsed into the seats, exhausted but alive. As we lifted off, I saw them one last time. They stood at the tree line, their glowing eyes fixed on us. They didn't follow. They didn't need to. The message was clear. This was their territory, and we were lucky to leave it alive. Back at base, we debriefed with a man who introduced himself as Agent Carter. No relation, he assured me with a humorless smile. He listened to our story without comment, then handed us non-disclosure agreements. These incidents never happened, he said. You were on a training exercise, understood? We nodded. What else could we do? But here's the thing. Training exercises don't haunt your dreams. They don't leave you wondering how many others have disappeared into those woods without a team to pull them out. They don't make you question what else is out there, watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. So if you're ever near Hollow Ridge and hear howling in the distance, don't ignore it. Don't think it's just wolves, because it's not, and it never was.